The woman stood on the station platform as the last of the afternoon light bled out of the sky, taking all the warmth with it. The wind, a harbinger of the coming plains winter, had teeth. It bit at the thin wool of her shawl, a garment wholly inadequate for this new, harsh country. She held herself perfectly still, a posture of dignity that was her last remaining fortification against the despair clawing at the edges of her composure. Inside, a cold deeper than the wind was settling into her bones. She was alone, a stranger in a town that had already passed its judgment. Earlier that day, she had walked from this same station to the town's only bank, a squat brick building that seemed to exhale an air of self-importance. In her satchel, she carried a worn leather portfolio containing the legal documents that were her only inheritance, her only claim to a future. Her husband, a man she had known for 6 weeks before he set off west with promises of a ready-made life, had died of a fever 2 states away. She had completed the journey alone, fueled by a desperate, dwindling hope that his letters had been true. The banker, a man whose polished softness was more unnerving than any hardened frontier face, had ushered her into his office. He examined the papers her husband had sent, his fingers drumming a quiet, dismissive rhythm on the polished oak of his desk. He had smiled a smile that did not touch his eyes. The claim, he explained with practiced sympathy, was tied to a debt. A foolish investment, really. With her husband's passing, the debt was null, and therefore, so was the claim. The papers were worthless. "A shame," he had said, sliding the documents back across the desk. "Your husband was optimistic." The word was a carefully chosen insult. She saw the lie in the flat, predatory gleam of his eyes. She knew, with an instinct honed by a life of navigating the subtle currents of power, that these papers held value. He knew it too. He made a show of magnanimity, offering her a few dollars for the documents, a charitable gesture to help a poor widow on her way. It was the pittance one might offer for a thing they intended to steal. "No, thank you," she had said, her voice quiet but firm. She had gathered the papers, placed them back in her satchel, and walked out of the bank, the banker's thin smile following her like a shadow. Now, that defiance felt like a hollow victory. The sun was gone. The windows of the town's mercantile and saloon cast yellow, judgmental rectangles of light onto the dusty street, illuminating a world to which she had no access. She had no money for a hotel room, no funds for the meal, whose smells drifted tantalizingly on the wind. The next train east would not arrive for 2 days. The townspeople who hurried past averted their gazes, their thoughts as plain as the disapproval on their faces. She was an outsider, a problem, a piece of driftwood washed up on their shore. They were waiting for the tide to take her away again. She drew the thin shawl tighter, her knuckles white, and stared out at the darkening plains, a vast, indifferent sea of grass. The rancher saw her first as he was leaving the bank, having just endured his own frustrating encounter with the man inside. He had seen the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, the careful way she held her satchel, and had recognized the look in her eyes as she departed, the look of someone who had just been expertly lied to. He knew that look well. He knew the banker's methods, his way of using legal jargon like a weapon to disarm the vulnerable. Now, hours later, as he loaded the last of his supplies into his wagon, he saw her again. She was still at the station, a solitary figure silhouetted against the deepening twilight. She had not moved in what must have been a very long time. The wind was picking up, and he watched her shiver, a small, involuntary tremor that she tried to suppress. He was a man who had built high fences around his life, a recluse by choice, since his wife had been taken by sickness 5 years prior. His heart was a fallow field he had no intention of ploughing again. But his sense of justice was a different matter. It was a bedrock principle, hard and unyielding. He observed the town's reaction to her, the same cold shoulder he had received for years, though for different reasons. They saw his scars, his silence, and kept their distance. They saw her foreign face, her poverty, and did the same. He felt a familiar, weary disgust. He had a large, isolated ranch, a place of profound silence and hard work. It was also a place where the books had fallen into a state of chaos since his wife, who had a mind for numbers, had passed. He was a man of cattle and land, Columns of figures were a foreign language to him. He finished tying the tarp over his supplies, his movements deliberate. He did not want to get involved. Involvement was complicated, messy, but leaving her there, to the mercy of the cold and the town's indifference, felt like a quiet kind of crime. He pulled his heavy sheepskin coat tighter around himself, the familiar weight a comfort, and then, with a resigned sigh that plumed in the frigid air, he began to walk toward the station. He stopped a few feet from her, not wanting to startle her. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, and she did not brush it away. Her focus was fixed on the horizon, as if she could will a train to appear from the empty darkness. "The next train ain't for 2 days," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. She turned, her expression guarded, but not fearful. He saw intelligence in her dark eyes, and a resilience that had not yet been extinguished. "I am aware," she replied, her voice low and clear, her words precise. He nodded, looking not at her but at the darkened windows of the bank down the street. "That man in there," he said, a statement, not a question. "He offered you next to nothing for what you have." Her gaze followed his. A flicker of surprise crossed her face before she masked it. "He did." The rancher grunted. He was not a man for pleasantries or gentle inquiries. He dealt in the practical, the tangible. "It's getting cold," he stated. "You have no room at the hotel." Again, not a question. Her stillness was answer enough. He met her eyes directly then, and she saw the intricate map of scars that covered the left side of his face, a testament to a past violence he did not speak of. His eyes, however, were clear and direct. "My ranch is 15 miles out," he began, his tone strictly business. "My ledgers are a disaster, been that way for 5 years. I need a bookkeeper, someone who can make sense of them." He paused, letting the offer settle in the cold air between them. "Room and board, a fair wage for the work. It's a practical arrangement. I need the help." He had framed it perfectly, a transaction that offered her a foothold without the sting of charity. He was not rescuing a damsel. He was hiring an employee. It was an offer that respected the dignity she had fought so hard to maintain. She studied his face, searching for any hint of the banker's duplicity, any sign of ulterior motive. She found none. She saw only a weariness that seemed to mirror her own, and a straightforward honesty that was as stark and real as the landscape around them. As if to seal the offer, he shrugged out of his own sheepskin coat. The garment was heavy, smelling faintly of wood smoke, leather, and the cold night air. Before she could protest, he draped it over her shoulders. The sudden warmth was a shock, a profound physical comfort that almost broke her composure. The weight of it was immense, a solid, tangible shield against the wind. "Well?" he asked, his voice impatient, as if embarrassed by his own gesture. She looked from his scarred face to the unwelcoming lights of the town, then back to him. In this hard place, a practical offer was a rarer kindness than 1,000 sympathetic words. She pulled the heavy coat tighter around herself, the warmth seeping into her chilled body. "I accept," she said. The journey to the ranch was made in silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves. The landscape was a vast, monochrome canvas of grey and black under a sliver of moon. The woman sat beside the rancher, wrapped in the heavy coat, the silence between them not awkward but elemental. It was the quiet of two people who had little left for small talk, who understood that survival was a matter of action, not words. The ranch house was as stark and unadorned as its owner. It was a solid structure of timber and stone, built to withstand the wind and the snow, not to offer comfort. Inside, a layer of dust coated every surface, a fine grey powder that spoke of a long period of neglect. A fire was laid in the hearth, but unlit. The air was cold and still. The place felt suspended in time, as if its heart had stopped beating years ago. The rancher showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the endless plains. "This will be yours," he said, his words clipped. He left her there, and soon she heard him moving about in the main room, the sounds of a fire being kindled. She did not sleep that first night. She lay under the quilt, listening to the house settle and the wind howl outside, a lonely and desolate sound. She was a world away from everything she had ever known, her future now tied to this scarred, silent man and his house of ghosts. Yet for the first time in weeks, she was warm and safe from the elements. It was a fragile foundation, but it was a foundation nonetheless. The next morning, she rose before dawn. She found the rancher already gone, a pot of coffee left warming on the stove. She drank a cup of the strong, black brew and then turned her attention to the ledgers he had mentioned. He had left them stacked on a sturdy table in a corner of the main room. They were, as he had promised, a disaster. Years of receipts, invoices, and handwritten notes were stuffed between the pages. The columns of figures were haphazard, often trailing off into illegibility. It was the financial record of a man adrift in grief, keeping his business afloat through sheer force of will, while the details disintegrated around him. She sat down, rolled up her sleeves, and began her work. For days, she immersed herself in the tangled numbers. She worked with a methodical precision that was an extension of her own quiet nature. She created new pages, drawing clean, straight lines, transferring the chaotic data into a system of order. The rancher would come in from his work long after the sun had set, covered in the dust and grime of his labor. He would find his dinner kept warm on the stove and a fresh pot of coffee brewed. They would eat in their customary silence, and then he would sit by the fire cleaning his tack or mending a bridle, while she continued to work at the table under the light of an oil lamp. Slowly, methodically, she began to untangle the mess, and as she did, a pattern began to emerge. It started with the receipts from the town's mercantile. She noticed small, consistent overcharges, a few cents here, $1 there, an insidious financial bleed that had amounted to a significant sum over 5 years. Then she examined the loan documents from the bank. The interest rates were predatory, and there were fees for processing, for late payments that were never late, that were clearly fraudulent. The banker was not merely an opportunist, he was a parasite, slowly draining the lifeblood of the ranches he purported to serve. The woman felt a cold, quiet anger solidify within her. This was not just about business, it was a violation. Beyond the books, she began to bring order to the house as well. She aired out the dusty rooms, scrubbed the floors, and washed the grime from the windows, letting the pale winter sunlight spill into the long neglected spaces. In a chest, she found old seed packets and a set of gardening tools. Outside the kitchen door was a small, fallow plot of earth surrounded by a low stone wall. It had once been a garden. She began to turn the soil, preparing it for the spring, an act of faith in a future that was still uncertain. The rancher watched all of this from a distance. He was a man who understood the language of work better than the language of words. He saw the order emerging from the chaos of his finances and his home. He saw the intelligence in her careful, deliberate movements. He noticed the small things, the way the house no longer felt empty when he walked in, the way the scent of baking bread sometimes filled the air, the way the garden plot was slowly being reclaimed from the weeds. He had hired a bookkeeper, but he was beginning to understand that he had brought something more vital back to his ranch. He had brought back a sense of life, a quiet, steady pulse that had been absent for 5 years. He began to look for it, to listen for it. He found himself pausing by the door before he went out in the morning, listening to the quiet scratch of her pen on paper. One evening, he came to her table and laid a set of plans before her, diagrams for a new corral. "The north fence is weak," he said, his finger tracing a line on the paper. "I'm thinking of moving the holding pen here, closer to the creek. What do you think?" She studied the plans, her brow furrowed in concentration. She pointed to a section. "If you move it there, the runoff from the spring thaw will pool against the western wall. The posts will rot faster. Here," she said, her finger moving to a slightly higher piece of ground. "The drainage is better. It will cost more in fencing, but it will last twice as long." Prairie. He looked at where she pointed, then back at her. No one had challenged his judgment about his own land in a very long time. He saw the logic in her assessment immediately. It was practical, intelligent, and forward-thinking. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. Prairie. It was a small moment, but it marked a significant shift in their dynamic. He began to consult her on other matters: the price of feed, the sale of a small group of steers, the hiring of a new ranch hand for the spring. He listened to her counsel, valuing her clear-headed perspective. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the silence of strangers sharing a roof, but the comfortable, companionable silence of partners engaged in a common enterprise. He started leaving a freshly picked wildflower, when he could find one, on the corner of her desk in the morning. She started mending the tears in his work shirts, the stitches neat and almost invisible. These were their conversations, a language of small, practical kindnesses that spoke more than words ever could. The respect between them grew, a quiet, sturdy thing, like a well-tended fence line. Word of the woman's presence at the ranch inevitably filtered back to the town, carried on the currents of gossip and speculation. The banker was particularly interested. His initial plan had been simple: acquire the woman's worthless papers, which he knew detailed a forgotten easement that would grant access to the river through the rancher's property, making an adjacent parcel of his own land far more valuable. When that failed, he had assumed the woman would simply disappear. Her employment by the reclusive rancher was an unwelcome complication. The rancher was stubborn and, despite his isolation, respected for his integrity. The banker had been counting on the man's financial disorganization as leverage to eventually force a land sale. He now had a dreadful suspicion that the woman, with her quiet intelligence, was putting those very accounts in order. His leverage was evaporating, and worse, his long-running systematic fraud was in danger of being exposed. He shifted his tactics from covert greed to public condemnation. He began to sow seeds of doubt and insinuation throughout the town. He spoke in concerned tones to the merchant's wife about the impropriety of the living arrangement. He hinted to the men in the saloon that the old rancher, lost in his grief, had been taken in by a clever foreign woman with questionable morals. He painted a picture of a vulnerable man being manipulated, a narrative that played on the town's inherent suspicion of outsiders. The town, eager for a drama to break the monotony of their hard lives, readily accepted the story. The whispers that had followed the woman on her first day now grew into a low murmur of judgment. When the rancher came to town for supplies, he was met with cold stares and closed faces. The merchant, who was deeply in debt to the banker, suddenly found reasons to deny him credit. The pressure escalated when the banker made a formal move. He sent a letter, delivered by a boy from the town, informing the rancher that the bank was calling in the outstanding note on his primary loan. The reason given was a minor fabricated covenant violation, failure to maintain a certain fence line that bordered the banker's own property. It was a transparently hostile act, a declaration of war. A few days later, the banker himself rode out to the ranch. He found the rancher splitting wood, the axe rising and falling with a steady, powerful rhythm. The woman was nearby, turning the soil in her nascent garden. The banker dismounted, his town clothes and polished boots looking absurdly out of place. He smiled his thin, predatory smile. "A difficult situation," he began, gesturing vaguely toward the distant, disputed fence. "The board is very strict on these matters." He let the lie hang in the air. "However, I might be able to persuade them to be lenient." The rancher stopped, leaning the axe against the chopping block. He said nothing, his scarred face a stony mask. The banker's gaze shifted to the woman, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "Your situation here, it's causing talk. It reflects poorly. People are concerned." He turned back to the rancher. "Perhaps if you were to simplify your affairs, send the woman on her way, and, as a show of good faith, you could sell me that southern parcel, the one with the creek access. It would more than cover the note and put this unfortunate business behind us." It was the same piece of land the woman's papers secretly controlled. The entire scheme was laid bare. The rancher slowly wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at the banker, his eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky. "Get off my land," he said, his voice low and flat. The banker's smile faltered. He held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Just a friendly suggestion. You have 30 days to pay the note in full. After that, the bank will begin foreclosure proceedings." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and silent threats in his wake. The rancher watched him go, then turned his gaze to the woman. She had not stopped her work in the garden, but her shoulders were rigid, They both knew a line had been crossed. The polite fictions had been stripped away, leaving only the hard, ugly reality of the fight to come. The night the fire came was moonless and dry, with a restless wind that rattled the window panes and moaned around the corners of the house. The rancher woke to a smell that every man of the plains fears, the acrid scent of burning grass. He threw back his blankets and went to the window. The northern sky was not black, but a hellish flickering orange. A wave of fire, pushed by the strong wind, was racing across his pasture land, straight for the main barn and the house. "Fire!" he roared, pulling on his boots and trousers. He burst from his room to find the woman already in the main room, dressed and pulling a heavy blanket from a storage chest. Her face was pale in the flickering firelight that now filled the house, but her eyes were clear and focused. There was no panic in her, only a grim resolve. He ran to the small bunkhouse to rouse his 2 ranch hands while she went to the well, working the pump handle with a frantic, steady rhythm, filling every bucket she could find. The rancher and his men focused on the barn. It housed their livestock, their winter hay, their entire livelihood. The roar of the approaching flames was deafening, a hungry, living thing. They worked in a desperate, choking haze of smoke, driving the terrified horses and cattle out of the barn and into the far corral, away from the path of the fire. The rancher was leading the last of the horses out, a panicked stallion fighting him at every step, when he felt a sudden, searing pain. He looked down. A burning timber from the barn's roof had fallen, pinning his leg to the ground. The heat was immense, the pain blinding. The horse, screaming in terror, tore free from his grasp and galloped into the smoky darkness. He tried to pull his leg free, but the beam was too heavy. The fire was licking at the walls of the barn around him, the structure groaning as it began to surrender to the flames. He was trapped. Through the swirling smoke he saw a figure emerge. It was the woman. She had seen him go down. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes wide with urgency. She didn't shout or scream. She acted. She grabbed a long, sturdy fence post from a nearby pile, a piece of wood that was nearly as tall as she was. Grunting with the effort, she wedged one end under the burning timber. She put her entire body into it, using the post as a lever, her muscles straining against the impossible weight. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a final, desperate heave, the beam lifted just a few inches. It was enough. The rancher dragged his leg free, his boots smoking, the pain a nauseating wave. She dropped the post and rushed to his side, helping him limp away from the collapsing barn just as the main roof gave way in a shower of sparks and embers. She got him clear of the immediate danger and then turned her attention to the new threat. The wind had shifted. The fire, having consumed much of the pasture, was now being driven directly toward the house. The 2 ranch hands were still fighting a losing battle near the far fence line. Without a word, the woman ran back to the well, soaking the blanket she had pulled from the chest earlier. She dragged the heavy, dripping wool to the side of the house, beating at the small tongues of flame that were beginning to lick at the wooden porch. She worked with a fierce, focused energy, a lone figure battling the inferno to save their home. Her unexpected, clear-headed defense of the house gave the rancher and his men the crucial moments they needed to regroup and bring the fire near the dwelling under control. They fought until dawn, when the wind finally died and the fire burned itself out, leaving a vast, black scar across the land. The barn was a smouldering ruin, but the livestock was safe, and the house, scorched but intact, was still standing. In the grey, smoky light of the new day, they stood together, surveying the devastation. Exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on them. The rancher's leg was badly burned, the denim of his trousers seared to the skin. The woman led him to the kitchen and made him sit, her movements gentle but firm. She cut away the fabric and cleaned the wound with a quiet, professional competence, her touch surprisingly sure. The adrenaline of the crisis faded, leaving a raw, aching vulnerability in its place. The rancher looked at her, at the soot on her face, and the singed ends of her hair, and saw the person who had saved him, who had saved his home. The high fences he had built around his heart seemed to have burned down with his pasture. "I lost my wife to a fever," he said, his voice rough, cracked with smoke and emotion. "The doctor was a day's ride away. I thought I could handle it myself. I was too proud to ask for help from my neighbors. By the time I swallowed that pride, It was too late. He stared at his bandaged leg, but he was seeing a ghost. "I've been alone ever since. I was afraid of losing this place. It's all I have left of them." She finished tying the bandage, her hands stilling on his leg for a moment. She looked up, her own carefully constructed composure beginning to fray. "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I married him because my family required it. I did not know him. He sent letters with promises of a good life. I think he was a dreamer, not a practical man. When he died, I was not sad. I was frightened. I have never been so alone." In the quiet of the smoke-filled kitchen, they had finally confessed the truths of their pasts, the grief and the fear that had shaped them into the solitary people they were. He reached out, his calloused, soot-stained hand covering hers where it rested on his knee. Her fingers were small and fine-boned against his, but he could feel their strength. It was the first time they had touched with intentional tenderness. It was not a gesture of passion, but of something deeper, a recognition of a shared struggle, an acknowledgement of a bond that had been forged in the crucible of the fire. In the ruins of his ranch, something new and fragile had begun to take root. In the days that followed the fire, a new clarity settled over the ranch. The physical act of clearing the debris and assessing the damage became a metaphor for their own lives. They were starting over from the ground up, while the rancher and his men began the arduous task of salvaging what they could from the barn's wreckage. The woman returned to the ledgers. The fire had come close to the house, and some of the books were water-damaged from the fight to save the porch, but the most important documents were safe. It was in an old family Bible, a book she had moved for safekeeping, that she found it. Tucked between pages of the Old Testament was the original deed to the ranch, signed and sealed 2 generations prior. It was a delicate, brittle document. As she carefully read the looping, old-fashioned script, her eyes caught on a clause detailing the water rights. She carried it to the table and laid it beside the bank's loan agreement. The discrepancy was immediate and glaring. The banker's document contained a subtly rephrased clause, a masterful piece of forgery that appeared to sever the primary water rights from the main body of the land, attaching them instead to the southern parcel he had been so eager to acquire. It was the final, irrefutable proof of his fraud. He had not merely been cheating the rancher, he had been systematically trying to steal the very heart of his land. She showed it to the rancher that evening. He studied the 2 documents, his face grim. The quiet anger that had been simmering within him now hardened into cold, unshakable resolve. "He didn't just set a fire," the rancher said, his voice tight. "He's been trying to burn me out for years." The next morning they rode into town together. The rancher's leg was still bandaged, and he moved with a stiff limp, but he sat tall in the saddle. The woman rode beside him, the original deed and the forged loan document wrapped in oilcloth and tucked securely in her satchel. They did not go to the town marshal, a man they knew to be squarely in the banker's pocket. They rode directly to the mercantile, which, at this time of day, was the social and economic hub of the town. They entered the store together. A hush fell over the customers as they saw the rancher, his face set like granite, and the quiet, foreign woman at his side. The banker was at the main counter, sharing a joke with the merchant. His laughter died in his throat when he saw them. The rancher walked directly to the counter, his limp making each step a deliberate, heavy thud on the wooden floorboards. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet intensity of his presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "You tried to burn me out," he said, the words falling like stones into the sudden silence. He laid the 2 documents on the counter, the original beside the forgery. "And you tried to steal my water with this forged paper." The banker's face went pale. He tried to bluster, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding, but the evidence was there for all to see. The woman stood silently beside the rancher, her presence a powerful and unassailable testament to the truth of his words. The townspeople, the same people who had whispered and judged, now looked from the hard, honest face of the rancher to the crumbling facade of the banker. They had known the rancher for years. They knew his quiet integrity, his steadfastness, and they recognized the look of a cornered rat in the banker's eyes. His social power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, shattered in that moment. The merchant, seeing his own chance to escape the banker's financial grip, was the first to speak, confirming a long-held suspicion about the banker's crooked dealings. Others soon followed. The banker was finished. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet. The air between them had changed once more. The tension of the impending conflict was gone, replaced by a sense of profound, shared victory. They had faced ruin together and had emerged stronger. The silence was no longer about comfort or companionship. It was about the unspoken question of what came next. That evening, they sat on the porch of the scorched but surviving house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the blackened land before them. The rancher turned to her, his hands resting on his knees. "The arrangement we had," he said, his voice steady. "The work you were hired to do, it's done. The books are in order. The threat is gone." He paused, and her heart clenched with a sudden, sharp fear. "I can't pay you as a bookkeeper anymore." The silence that followed stretched for an eternity. She looked down at her hands, her carefully constructed world threatening to dissolve once more. "But I'm asking you to stay," he continued, his voice softer now and filled with a raw sincerity she had never heard from him before. "Not as an employee, I'm asking you to stay as my wife, as my partner." She looked up, her eyes meeting his. In their depths, she saw not pity or obligation, but a profound and humbling respect. "This ranch," he said, gesturing to the scarred land around them, "it's as much yours as it is mine. You saved it. You saved me. I don't have fancy words, but I know this. I trust you. I respect you. I want to build a life with you, right here, from these ashes." Tears she had refused to shed through all her hardship now welled in her eyes. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a deep, quiet joy that felt as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet. She had arrived in this place with nothing, a stranger to be cast aside. And now this good, honourable man was offering her everything. He was offering her a home. Her answer was as simple and direct as his proposal. "Yes," she said. A year later, the land had begun to heal. The spring rains had washed away the soot, and new green shoots of grass pushed their way through the blackened soil, a testament to the resilience of the earth. A new barn, larger and sturdier than the one it replaced, stood as a proud symbol of their shared labour. Its fresh-cut pine scent mingled with the sweet smell of hay and the rich aroma of the dark, turned earth in the garden. The garden itself was her domain, a thriving, orderly plot overflowing with vegetables and herbs. It fed them, but more than that, it was a daily reminder of how life could be coaxed from even the most unforgiving ground. Inside the house, the ledgers were perfectly balanced. The ranch, under their joint stewardship, was more prosperous than it had ever been. The banker was long gone, having fled town in disgrace, his assets sold off to cover a fraction of his debts. The townspeople now treated the rancher and his wife with a quiet, profound respect. They were no longer the reclusive widower and the foreign woman. They were a formidable partnership, a cornerstone of the community they had once been ostracized from. The woman, now several months pregnant, stood on the porch, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The child within her was a promise, a future taking root. The rancher came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence, a habit that had become their most intimate form of communication. They watched the sun dip below the horizon, setting the vast sky ablaze with colour. The evening air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. It was a peaceful end to a peaceful day. "I never thought I would see this land look so green again," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He was thinking of the fire, of the despair he had felt standing in the ashes of his past. She leaned back against his solid strength, a small smile touching her lips. "It just needed tending," she replied softly. Her words hung in the quiet air, a simple truth that encompassed everything. The land, the ranch, his wounded heart, her own lonely soul, all of it had just needed tending. Together, they had cultivated a life from the ashes, a quiet, sturdy, and deeply cherished peace. They continued to watch as the last light faded, two solitary figures who had found their home not in a place, but in each other.